phone?
It is, yeah.
That's fine.
My bag is here.
Right.
I was going to leave it with my colleague. Maybe I should just do that.
Yeah, I've stuck my bag over there.
Mine's right
So.
at the side, if that helps. Okay, so I think we're about ready. Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for joining us for the session, Pathways to Progress, Evolving DEI&A, that's going to trip me up a lot, initiatives in academic publishing. So we've got two great speakers for you today. First up, we will have Fiona Counsell. Fiona is currently Head of Editorial Policy and Process in the Journals Division at Taylor & Francis, a role which combines strategic growth, editor engagement, and policy development and implementation. Fiona's been with T&F since 2009, initially managing planning and urban studies journals in editorial, before taking on a cross-functional open access role. She's also the chair of the steering committee for the Joint Commitment for Action on Inclusion and Diversity in Publishing, a cross-publisher DEI&A group. Our second speaker, Rebecca Brennan, is senior editor for Social Science Books Europe at Princeton University Press, based in their Oxford office. She commissions scholarly and trade titles from across the social sciences and also sits on the Princeton University Press Equity and Inclusion Council. So following what I'm sure will be two excellent presentations, we should have around 10 to 15 minutes for debate and questions, and we'll aim to release you on time for the coffee break. So with that in mind, let me pass over to Fiona.
Thank you, Laura. So yeah, as Laura mentioned, I'm Fiona Counsell, and my current role with Taylor & Francis is Head of Editorial Policy and Process. My 16 years there includes lots of open access work as well as managing journals. I've been involved in DEI activities at Taylor & Francis since 2017, when I was involved in setting up our Women in Publishing group, before I even knew what the acronyms CRG or CRN even meant. When taking on my current role in 2022, I also became involved in DEI in my day job as well, as I considered what T&F's editorial policies and processes in relation to DEI should be, particularly those in relation to our role, the DEI of our scholarly communities that we serve via our journals. I've been invited today mainly as a representative of the Joint Commitment for Inclusion and Diversity in Scholarly Publishing, which I do also have to read every time, so I will trip up over that. It's a cross-industry initiative on which I serve as the co-chair of the steering committee. I look forward to sharing a bit more about the joint commitment later on, but I'll be sharing a bit about some broader DEI thoughts first. And first of all, a big caveat, I'm not a DEI professional. I'm a publishing professional who has an interest in DEI and does that in my day job. So there are, a bit of grace that we're mostly all learning on the job when we do DEI within publishing. Firstly, I like to draw a bit of a distinction between three different types of DEI. The first I call internal DEI, and is typically concerned with the makeup and experience of colleagues within our publishing houses. It's quite often colleague run, but it's likely to have a sort of HR or organisational development sponsorship, if not leadership. And it's much more about the way in which people who work within our publishing houses experience their inclusion as part of their working lives. The second type of DEI I call external. And again, because I'm not a professional, I don't know if these are official terms, they're just the way I think about things. And that's the role we play as publishers in the careers of researchers and in scholarly communications more broadly. Publishing activities such as authoring, editing, reviewing, and otherwise being actors in scholarly comms is a big part of the researcher's working life, and it's very influential on researcher careers. And there are a number of points in the publishing process where bias, either overt or unconscious, can impact decision-making and therefore really impact people's careers. The Royal Society of Chemistry data showed a gender difference in the likelihood of acceptance of journal articles, to name just one of those points where bias can come in. Activity in external DEI is most likely to be led by publishing staff within a publishing organisation. Moving on to the third, and again, it's not an official term, but more profoundly, I think publishers have a role in how DEI is embedded within the research process or research production itself. So I call it embedded DEI. And some examples would be the Sex and Gender Equality in Research, or SAGA guidelines, which was led by the Gender Policy Committee of the European Association of Science Editors. I want to get these words right, so I'm reading them. Or the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance, which were drafted at International Data Week, the Research Data Alliance plenary in 2018. An embedded DEI, where we're looking to ensure that DEI is really part of the knowledge production process itself, is more likely to be a cross-industry, a cross-publisher initiative. And not just publisher, of course, across all types of scholarly comms, including librarians and funders. A lot of publishers and other organisations in our industry are doing all of these types of DEI, but much less often is it part of an integrated strategy where the organisation is bringing together all the types of, 3 types of DEI under a single leadership and a strategy programme. And I have to say, I was really impressed by what I've read about Princeton University Press's work. So that does seem to exemplify something which is really integrated on all 3 types. And we're looking forward to hearing more from Rebecca later. A little bit of industry landscape to situate the work of the joint commitment. You're likely to be familiar with C4DISC, a coalition for diversity and inclusion in scholarly comms. And C4DISC aims to increase diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility within the Scholl comms industry. And it was founded by trade and professional associations, and they provide resources, training, and best practices. Several university presses are partners in C4DISC, I noticed. Generally, I would say the focus of C4DISC is internal DEI. It's more about the industry itself and the people who work within publishing. However, I would shout out their equity toolkits for editorial teams, which is a really good example of that more external and embedded DEI. They're really good, by the way. Do check them out on their website. The STM have lots of initiatives in the DEI space and recently established a task and finish group looking at elements of both internal, external and embedded DEI. And Sarah Phipps is here today, and hopefully she will share more about STM's work during the Q&A session. There's lots of other organisations which touch upon DEI within their work, such as the Principles of Transparency and Best Practice in Scholarly Publishing, which was jointly created by DOAJ, OASPA, COPE, and the World Association of Medical Editors. And of course, those EASE efforts on the SAGA guidelines, for instance. External and embedded in DEI's work is characterised by collaborative action across the industry, and it allows us to all share knowledge, expertise, standardise our system, standardise our actions in ways that's really helpful to other stakeholders in our sphere, such as systems providers, librarians, and researchers. Which leads me on to the joint commitment. So these are the joint commitment started, it was sponsored by the Royal Society of Chemistry, and they set up an initial workshop of interested organisations. And they came up with this set of four, I call them the commitments, 4 principles that the joint commitment would stand behind. The first was to understand our research community. And the tagline behind that was to collaborate to enable diversity data to be self-reported by members of our community, work towards a collective and compliant system so that researchers only need to self-report once, share and analyse anonymised diversity data to understand where action is needed, reflect the diversity of our community, use those anonymised data to set baselines and benchmarks and minimum targets, achieve appropriate inclusive representation of our authors, reviewers and editorial decision makers. Share success amongst the partners within the joint commitment in order to develop new and innovative resources to have the most impact and be shared across stakeholders across the industry. And finally, to set minimum standards on which to build. But you'll notice that's crossed out because the group have done that. So we're now changing that bit of the original commitment to say, working towards the minimum standards for inclusion and diversity. These are those minimum standards. These were set up in the belief that minimum standards will enable senior leaders in publishing and to evaluate their performance and progress on inclusion and diversity within their organisations and publications, and help them to identify achievable specific actions they can take to improve inclusion and diversity. These minimum standards do not encompass human resource management, and the way in which the standards are implemented will vary. And it's expected that every organisation who joins the joint commitment will adopt in good faith and work towards implementing these standards. And organisations who adopt the minimum standards are encouraged to make that commitment public. But it's not just words, it's not just a statement, it's all about action within the joint commitment. So how does it work? Well, we're comprised of a steering committee or steering group, a working group and some subgroups. The working group is comprised of at least one representative from each signatory of the organisation, but the working group is also open to anybody who wants to come and be part of the meetings and learn from what's going on within the joint commitment. It meets 3 times a year. It's a bit aspirational sometimes, but we try. And those meetings focus on reviewing progress, agreeing actions, setting direction, and sharing news and updates. We have a steering committee, which was formed in March 2023, and we meet monthly. The chairs of the subgroups were automatically appointed to the steering committee, and then other seats were filled via nomination. And the RSC, as the convening organisation, hold a permanent seat on the steering committee, and they provide some FTE time to support the administration of the joint commitment, communicating with members, for instance. However, the steering committee membership has changed substantially in the last year and a half. I joined the steering committee in November 2023, and by March 2024, I was the longest running member of the steering committee, and therefore, bravely, I like to think, stepped up to be the co-chair about a year ago. The role of the steering committee is to provide leadership and strategic direction for the joint commitment, and all the things that you would imagine that we would do as part of an industry steering committee. We've recently been working on developing our short-term priorities for the next couple of years. I think that has particularly come at a period of time where we've had to completely restaff the steering committee, so getting everybody up to speed and reimagining what we've inherited from our predecessors and what's next. And then, of course, the landscape for DEI has changed quite a lot in the last few months. So considering how we might need to adapt what we were going to do to be able to respond to that situation. We've got subgroups within the joint commitment, and really this is where the work happens. The work of the joint commitments happens within the subgroup. At the moment we have 3 which groups which have been going for quite a while. Anyone who is part of the working group can join a subgroup. They meet regularly, collate their own meeting notes and report back to the working group and the steering committee. I'll say a bit more about some of the subgroups later because I'm making a play for some new members. What have we achieved so far? Well, from the start, we've served as a knowledge sharing network, shared learning and resources. We've worked on such things as author names change practices. We've worked on tackling harmful historical content. We've launched the minimum standards. And our most recent and arguably most significant achievement is the publication of recommended questions or standardized questions for the collection of gender identity and race and ethnicity data from contributors. As we developed the recommended questions, we worked with the peer review system providers to deliver the functionality for publishers to collect this sensitive demographic data. And since releasing the questions, we've been working on encouraging their uptake. So this is the recommended gender question that can be implemented on a submission system to collect the information from authors, but can also be used to collect information from any other stakeholder, such as reviewers or editorial board members or editors. And it's a very specific question with a single option answer. The options use terms that refer to gender identity and not to sex. And there's no distinction between cis or transgender. It's not limited to only binary options, and it also ensures compliance with GDPR by offering a prefer not to disclose option. With the race and ethnicity questions, we're aiming for a global universal race and ethnicity schema, and that might sound like an incredible challenge. I wasn't involved in that bit of the process. This happened before I joined the joint commitment, but I'm told that it was part of an iterative process where the subgroup and all members of the working group shared their questions and insights. We received input from surveys of authors at ACS and at Elsevier and Springer Nature staff survey. The research and literature in this area was examined and synthesized. And on behalf of the joint commitment, Elsevier engaged an external subject matter expert, Professor Anne Morning from New York University, who has expertise in race and ethnicity. This is the first question for that section of the data, and the intention is not to devise a single objective or prescriptive truth about a researcher's race and ethnicity. It's rather to develop a set of options that resonate with the communities that we serve from around the globe, such that they are willing to self-report their racial and ethnic identity. The level of aggregation and the number of options we offer to respondents has to parallel the scale of diversity data we can practically accommodate and make use of. And this approach ties to both survey best practice and the legitimate interest requirement of GDPR, that we should not capture data that we don't intend to actively use. It's also not a single combined ethno-racial question, and it's not developed from any existing schema used by an existing country to sort of avoid that. The goal of fielding a survey question worldwide calls for a set of response options that seem reasonably familiar and pertinent to individuals. Geographical location and ancestry have that salience across the world. Also, a small minority of nations employ race in their official data collection, making racial self-identification a much less common experience in most areas of the world than it is in the United States or the United Kingdom. In an international survey, a question on geographic origin or ancestry would likely furnish finer-grained or more complete data than racial categories alone could, and most likely with higher response rates. with the race question, among the varied locations where one's ancestors may have resided, there is likely to be one with which a respondent is usually identified and may identify themselves, especially if they're... and those labels are likely to be particularly influential for individuals' opportunities and life outcomes, and thus particularly informative for a DEI survey. But despite the limitations of racial classification noted above, especially on a global survey, asking about race can in some cases provide additional information that is useful for work on diversity, equity and inclusion. So thinking about how we've seen uptake, ScholarOne manuscripts and Editorial Manager have implemented the GRE questions within their sites. We have to say we're not entirely happy with how they've been implemented, and some of the reporting still needs a lot of work. As far as I'm aware, of the publishers I'm aware of, Elsevier, RSC, Emerald, Sage, IOPP have implemented collection using these questions direct from authors on submission, and forthcoming at several more publishers, including Wiley. GRE questions, the gender, race and ethnicity questions, can also be used in other settings. I'm really sad to say that at Taylor & Francis we've not managed to implement collection for authors at the moment, but we did recently use the questions in a recent survey of our editors, and that was really useful. First experience of using them in real life. Sorry. So just some information about the different subgroups. Is that still working? Yeah. The subgroup led by Nicola Poser at AMS is working on the diversity data collection and reporting subgroup. This is the subgroup that created the standardized questions. And they have moved on to agreeing what baselines of data we're going to be reporting on, developing the mechanisms for collecting the data, collating the data from different peer review platforms. They're continuing to work with those platform vendors in making sure that they're implemented in a really useful way, supporting members in the challenges of implementing the schema, sharing experiences of members who are already using the schema, and discussing the ways in which that we can improve the schema as well. And the live issue that the subgroup is working on is reviewing the standardized questions sort of 2 years on, and the response schema, responding to some of the feedback, both positive and constructive, that we've received about the questions, and trying to make them better for everybody who's using them. The diversity of the working group, subgroup led by Amy Kwan at Sage, is putting our money where our mouth is, really, and looking at the diversity of the joint commitment working group itself. Turns out that using our joint commitment questions in an organisation spread across so many, with so many different members, the data governance side of things is actually really tricky. The policy collation and development subgroup is being led by my co-chair as steering committee, Jo Crumpfer at Wiley and Stephanie Hull from Emerald. And they're looking at collating existing policy documents from member publishers and devising any new policy guidelines where new gaps have been identified. And that group has been in abeyance for a number of years, so they are just getting themselves back off the ground. And really, this is where my big plea out for new members comes. I think there will be lots of people in the room who work in books publishing roles, and we're looking at launching a books subgroup within the joint commitment. Historically, most of the participants within the steering committee are journals publishers, but there is obviously a role to play in DEI within books publishing. We'll hear a lot more from Rebecca. And the goals of the subgroup are on the screen. I'm going to be the interim chair, just while we get off the ground, but hopefully a bona fide books publisher will volunteer to be the subgroup chair. So special call for participants, come and get in touch with me. How do you get involved? Well, you can attend the working group meetings as an individual or join the joint commitment as an organisation. You can volunteer in the subgroups, raise awareness of the joint commitment and what we're trying to do within your organisation, work towards the minimum standards within your organisation, and use the GRE standardised questions with contributors in other settings as well. So I've got a couple of final thoughts. What's next for the joint commitment? Well, the steering committee are busy trying to answer that question right this minute, partly as the group have achieved some of the key things it originally set out to do, and partly because of the turnover of folks involved in the steering committee. It's still really early days for the minimum standards and the questions. In the immediate future, we're sending out a survey to members to try and understand how their organisations are progressing with the minimum standards and the standardised questions, what blockers and challenges they're encountering, and what the JC can do to support. We're looking at the first revision of those standardised questions and restarting the activity of the other subgroups. We'd really love some folks here today to get involved in that book subgroup. We're also looking at comms, advocacy and spreading the word, and how we can work more closely with other organisations to amplify each other's work. I really want to also get on to benchmarking and target setting, because that's really what will make the difference when it comes to moving on to doing the work of DEI and not just measuring it, I think. Perhaps I can keep the challenges for questions later. Thank you, Laura.
Fiona. And just before any of my colleagues who are involved in the rollout can jump in, we've also rolled out those demographic questions at OUP as well for our authors.
Great, thanks. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm going to do a very brief tour through the last 7 years of equity, inclusion and belonging at PUP. I'm going to focus in on a couple of the programs we have that really represent our DE&I work. One that's more internal facing and two that are more external facing, to borrow from Fiona's definitions, which I'll be using. The hope here is not to be prescriptive or to suggest certainly not that ours is the only way to think about these issues, but just to give as many examples as possible and hopefully spark some ideas and discussions about what might work in your own presses. Shouldn't take too long, there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussions at the end. So our commitments to diversity, equity and inclusion are foregrounded on the About Us section of our website, right alongside our mission and our value statements. So it's one of the first things people learn about us when they're visiting our site. Building equity, inclusion and later belonging has been a clear strategic initiative of the press since 2017 really, when Christy Henry joined us as our director. With the full support of the staff and the Board of Trustees, the aim since then has been to really embed diversity, equity and inclusion and belonging in our work across both the organisation and within our publishing. Rather than it being an addition or a separate concern, it's really at the core of everything that we do, both internally and in our author and our market-facing activities. So the following slides will follow a roughly chronological pattern, and while the list is not exhaustive, I'm going to touch on both some of the key initiatives and hopefully the ethos behind those actions. So starting in 2017, the foundation of our approach was very much set up as one of listening and learning rather than kind of implementing an internally conceived idea of what equity, inclusion and belonging would look like at Princeton. Christy and the team sought opinions and suggestions from those who were working at the press and facilitated open and wide-ranging discussions about what E&I meant to the staff. The mission and the vision and the values were revised to embed equity and inclusion within them, and the initial simple but very ambitious aim was to increase the diversity of representation both on our staff and within our publishing. So that's our author pool. So the first year was very much a time of benchmarking and establishing our baselines. The graph on the left of this chart, on the left of this screen, shows the gender split of our authors at the point when we started this monitoring. For internal benchmarking, we also carried out compensation analysis for equity of pay. We continued on this journey of learning, which is going to be the theme throughout, and invited the Cornell Interactive Theatre to host their My Story training on authenticity, empathy, and inclusivity. We also offered training on the LARA method for challenging conversations and on implicit bias in hiring. This was also the point, skimming ahead, at which the E&I Council was created, who have responsibility to affect E&I change in their respective areas of our publishing. The group is appointed and chaired by the press director and the chief of staff. We also, alongside this, created the E&I Culture Committee, which is a staff-led, all-staff, optional opportunity to lead peer-to-peer knowledge growth, focusing on lived experience and its potential to inform all of our collaborations across the press. This is chaired by volunteers from within the staff. In terms of resourcing, our first moves were to expand our HR team, bringing in expertise on dealing with E&I transformations and initiatives, and then to convert all of our internships to paid ones. The Board of Trustees approved an initial amount of funding for these strategic E&I initiatives. This was initially $50,000 a year, and it's now grown to $250,000 annually. We also introduced our Code of Conduct at this point, which is attached to every book contract that we send out, and outlines the standards of behaviour that both we and our authors can expect from each other. It states that the press upholds a positive environment in which its staff, authors, reviewers, media, vendor, and all other partners can contribute to that mission and the business of peer reviewing publishing in an exemplary professional manner. This environment is defined by humanity, by generative relationships, equity and inclusion, and mutual respect. As such, the press has zero tolerance for racism or any other forms of discrimination or harassment, as well as illegal, dishonest, or unethical professional conduct. There's no place in our ecosystem for people who abuse their status, power, or influence, or behave in a manner that violates our recognised codes of conduct. As you can see from the next slide, 2019 was a busy year with deeper learning, more resources, more data, and more of the conversations and collaborations. To touch on just a few of these points, our director and a newly appointed chief of staff co-led the Association of American University Presses Task Force on Gender Equality and Cultures of Respect. We also launched our employee resource groups, which are staff-initiated and led. We initially had groups centred on BIPOC experiences, work-life integration, which helped to create our flexible work hours policy, and mentoring, and we've since expanded these to include both early and mid-career resource groups. In terms of gathering and sharing data, we participated in the Lee & Low Diversity Baseline Study of Publishing, and we also started reporting on the gender demographics of our publishing pipeline, so our future books, and we started to break this out by discipline as well, which is what you can see on the slide. We also launched our Global Equity Grants this year, which is the first policy I just wanted to pause and give a little bit more information on. So our Global Equity Grants are designed to support our mission to create a publishing programme that's diverse, equitable and inclusive, and we recognise that achieving this equity can often require a meaningful intervention on our part. So with that in mind, the grants were set up to invite authors of underrepresented groups to apply for a grant to support the preparations of works that are either under advance or final contract with the press, that are in production, or that have published in the last 12 months. These grants can be for a wide range of support, from assisting with translation or development editing costs, to hiring a research assistant, travel funds for research or event attendance, through to parental or family care. Every author is eligible to apply for one grant per book, and the applications are considered on a rolling basis. So then in 2020, which was obviously a quiet year otherwise, we continued our now established themes of communication, learning, and collaboration. So with a commitment to both integrating EI into our existing workflows, as well as creating a defined space for these conversations, topics were integrated into all department meetings explicitly, as well as having specific monthly updates sent by the director, and a Zoom chat channel was set up dedicated to E&I learning and kind of more informal peer-to-peer resource sharing. As a result of an equity assessment of PUP carried out by the Equity Paradigm, which included an all-press survey, meeting observation, and optional interviews, we learned more about our progress towards our E&I goals, and we were able to start adding E&I focus goals to annual performance and development reviews where that was appropriate. In specific department initiatives, Production Editorial introduced a new language and actively worked to expand the diversity of representation amongst our freelancer pool, and Editorial was set targets around diversifying representation in our authors. In 2021, we launched another of our 2 key actions, which I'll go into in a bit more detail. That's the Global Publishing Fellows and the Supporting Diverse Voices Book Proposal Development Grants. In addition to these, we added the E&I page I mentioned at the top to our website. We implemented a race and ethnicity survey for our authors, which builds on our previous work, which I described gathering gender data. And we started using the M-Train learning management system, which of all the learning management systems I've seen is certainly the most comprehensive. It's got a huge number of modules broken down into very specific and helpful categories, such as microaggressions, respecting gender diversity, framing cross-cultural communications, and many more. We also initiated a team-sourced PUP publishing glossary to help with transparency. I'm sure I don't need to tell you, there are a lot of acronyms and terminology, both general to publishing and specific to each company. And this is a kind of great and ever-evolving tool for decoding publishing speak for everyone who works at PUP. So to return to the 2 initiatives from the last slide that I wanted to focus on, the first of these is the PUP Publishing Fellows. This is an initiative aimed at addressing the lack of diverse representation across the publishing industry internally. So the fellowship is designed for individuals with no prior publishing experience who are from communities historically underrepresented within publishing, which the DEI&A data shows to be a majority white, straight, cisgender, and non-disabled industry. Applicants from a diversity of educational backgrounds are encouraged to apply, and an undergraduate degree is not required. The programme supports fellows annually for a full-time salaried position with one of the Press's global publishing teams. They receive mentoring and early career coaching, aiming to empower them with the experience and industry education to successfully pursue careers in publishing. We welcomed our 2 inaugural publishing fellows in July 2021, who are based out of our Princeton, New Jersey offices, and the second cohort joined in 2022, and then which allowed for the option of remote work. And then in 2023-2024, we included for the first time a UK-based fellow at our PUP Oxford office, and we've got another UK-based fellow in the current 24-25 fellowship. And this is funded to run for 5 years. So the third and final initiative I wanted to spotlight in this presentation is the Supporting Diverse Voices Book Proposal Development Grants. We recognise that there are a myriad ways to support authors in the earlier stages of a book's development, and specifically here we're looking at the ideas to proposal stage, and we wanted to ensure that this support is available to the greatest diversity of prospective authors. So with these grants, we offer historically excluded and underrepresented scholars across the globe the opportunity to develop a book proposal in group or in one-on-one settings with one of our partnering book coaches, each with their own approach to the collaborative development process. And the grants will cover the cost of these collaborations. So each grantee will have a sponsoring PUP editor who works with both the author and the coach throughout the process. And following the coaching, the grantee agrees to give PUP the right to consider the resulting proposal exclusively before they are free to submit any other publisher for consideration. And for any projects that we don't pursue, the sponsoring editor will mentor grantees on alternative possible publishing paths. For the first cycle in winter 2021, we opened the process to women, transgender, and gender-expansive authors in the science and maths, including both scholars and journalists. We've had cycles inviting BIPOC scholars from the social sciences, humanities, and then the sciences, and our most recent cycle invited underrepresented voices in the sciences, and our first 2025 cycle for humanities and social sciences scholars is currently open, closing on the 6th. In 2022 and 2023, we deepened our EIB programming, embedding our data collection within our workflows for all authors, contributors, and editors. We also pivoted our focus to include engagement, belonging, and wellness for our colleagues, representing the changing face of work in the light of the pandemic and resulting in large-scale shifts to hybrid and remote work. We introduced wellness weeks and monthly wellness days, where we share press-wide 2 full weeks of leave, one in the summer between Labour Day and the August Bank holiday, and one in winter between Christmas and New Year's, as well as 1 day a month where the press is closed. And this is in addition to colleagues' standard holiday allowance. We also launched our Accessibility Working Group, which looks at everything from alt text and accessibility guidelines for readers through to the physical accessibility of our offices and our author submission guidelines. And then finally, bringing us up to the present day, we are continuing, as the image on the right suggests, to try and publish and to persist with purpose. This involves further learning on key issues like AI and continuing to push into new areas of experimentation with our PUP audiobook program, which allows us to reach a diverse community, making the most of new technologies to ensure that we fulfill our most fundamental mission to bring scholarly ideas to the world in a creative and exciting way. Perhaps we will find a way to use AI in such a positive way soon. We also refreshed and reasserted the use of our internal network, the Galley, as a space for communication and collaboration across our teams, making important documentation easily accessible and discoverable for all. So in conclusion, here's a summary of our equity, inclusion, and belonging themes, and some of our lessons learned and that we continue very much to learn. I think it's fundamental to stress really that communication is key. There can never be too much, and input and engagement from staff, authors, and other stakeholders are so important, as well as realizing that strategies and their implementations are unlikely to be linear and need to be flexible to evolve and adapt over time. The need for collaboration also really can't be overstated, and we are so grateful for our partnerships and conversations with the Association of American Publishers, the Even Up group of presses, quite a few of whom are here today, the IPG, the Association of University Presses, and our supporting diverse voices, partner coaches, and of course our authors, to name just a few. So finally, I'll leave you with this quote from our Equity, Inclusion and Belonging statement, that we're committed to advancing more equitable and inclusive global publishing and to supporting the meaningful interventions needed to enact change. We believe that scholarly books and the ideas that are entrusted to us can achieve enduring impact when there's a greater diversity and inclusivity of voices collaborating in their creation at every stage of the publishing process. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, both of you, for such great presentations. And it's really, I think, heartening to see how much is happening in this space and how much is possible. So we'll open up now to questions from the floor. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a microphone will be delivered to you. Question over there.
Thank you. I'm Allison Levy. I'm director of Brown University Digital Publications in the U.S. We are not a press, more of a producer of born digital multimodal monographs. We also, another significant arm of our activity is around training the next generation of publishing professionals, but also authors predominantly. And one program that we have offered now for 2 years is a summer institute for authors from less well-resourced institutions who want to pursue a digital publication but don't have the infrastructure or the capacity at their home institutions. And both Christy Henry and Nico Fund have participated on the faculty of that program, which has been funded by the NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and just yesterday we learned that that grant was terminated. Brown is also threatened now with a loss of $510 million in federal funding since last night. So I guess my plea and my question is, how do we continue to do this very important work supporting authors in the interest of scholarship and readers? I just wanted to share that breaking news from my institution. I think we all will be affected by this. Our thoughts, of course, our investment has been with authors and the readership. So how do we continue to collaborate and really double down to continue the work?
I'm happy to. Yeah, sure. Firstly, I'm so sorry to hear about the funding. Real solidarity with that. I think that's going to be happening increasingly, not just in the US moving forward. I think for us, all we can say, as I say, we will continue to persist as much as we can. We're not shying away from any of the programs that I've listed now. We are continuing. We currently have a Supporting Diverse Voices grant open. I think collaboration is probably the way forward, and certainly if there are we're thinking about smaller presses in the session this morning, but if there are smaller groups, smaller presses, really working together and kind of coming together as an industry or as a group of presses, we can be stronger together. And, you know, as you say, Christy's been a part of that. Presses working with institutions and with authors, we are stronger together with these kinds of initiatives, and anything we can do to share resources, I think we'd always be open to doing that, and sharing time across presses as well, recognising that a lot of us are doing this, as Fiona alluded to, on top of day jobs as well. But I think communication and collaboration is what we're really going to have to focus on increasingly going forward.
I would add that we held our last working group meeting, I think, in the second week of February, and we dedicated quite a substantial portion of that meeting to collective therapy session, if you want to call it that. And there was a huge amount of emotion and upset and fear outpouring within that meeting, particularly from US-based society publishers. And there was a real plea for us to persist, to keep going, to keep providing that group of like-minded community of practice of individuals at organisations around the world who, despite it being under the spotlight, to keep going with the important DEI work. So that's what the joint commitment is determined to do, is to keep going and to keep supporting organisations that want to work towards the minimum standards and introduce the standardised questions and whatever we go on to do next as well.
Thank you for the question, and my sympathies as well to the recent developments. Any other questions?
Hi, Peter Berkery from the Association of University Presses. Hi, Allison. I just wanted to add to the comments that Allison made and maybe put a little more global, if you will, context around them. The association that I represent has signed on to statements opposing various aspects of what I refer to as the awful. And that's AWFUL, not OFFAL, though arguably either works. Various aspects of the awful, including attacks on the humanities, attacks on higher education, attempts to rewrite history, and certainly attacks on what the administration refers to as illegal DEI. And to be clear, they believe that DEI in and of itself is illegal. So the first thing to know is that this is going to take a long, long time to play out, right? We're just in the very early stages of this. The statements that we've signed on to, we know, mean absolutely nothing to the Trump administration. This is ultimately going to come down to multiple litigations on multiple fronts. Hopefully Brown has the spine that Cornell and Harvard and others have not had so far to resist and to sue the administration for its illegal actions. But whether they do or they don't, they'll make their calculation, right? All players will. But there will be lawsuits about all of these things. And that's where the rubber does or doesn't meet the road. We will join in those lawsuits as amici wherever we can, wherever it's consistent with our core values and our strategic plan. And one of two things will happen. The courts will rule in our favor, and the administration will or won't abide by the court decision, or the courts won't rule in our favor. So this is going to be a very long game. And the advice that I've given to the folks in the US, in our membership, is for the moment, keep your heads below the parapets, because we need you for the long run. And then the second thing I'd like to say, since this is largely a UK audience, is we know that the Trump administration does not respect national borders. We know that, for example, the US Embassy in Paris sent communications to executives at all of the CAC countries, companies, the largest 40 companies in France, asking them to certify that they were stepping back from all their DEI initiatives, which is outrageous on multiple levels. So the request I would make to this audience, and I know I'm speaking to a friendly crowd, the request I would make to this audience is when and if you get such requests, please fight them. I've been asked several times, let us know if there's anything we can do to help. For sure, that's one thing you can do to help. If you get that kind of request, be outraged and oppose it. And so I guess that wasn't really a question. That was just a series of comments, but I thought it might be helpful. Thanks.
Thank you.
Mandy Hill from Cambridge University Press. I just want to build briefly on what Peter said, and then I do have a question that's completely separate. One of the things we've been talking about as a potential risk here is that library customers and then contracts with us might start to require us to make a statement that we don't have EDI policies, and that could become a massive sales risk. We're, just to be clear, we're not going to change our values. We are going to retain our EDI policies and practice, but it's something that could really, where for us the rubber could really hit the road in some very real ways, and it could well be that individual institutions start doing that quite quickly because it might align with their own values in some states, and might be something they want to do, and others might feel they have to do it, and they might take a preemptive approach there. So we think that's something that in terms of scenario planning, that could be something we have to think about. The question actually was, again, as I say, completely separate. For a few years now, we've been collecting demographic data from our authors. I say we have been. We've been trying to collect demographic data from our book authors. If we believed the data we got back, we have a very large number of authors who are based in Afghanistan, which we, for clarity, I don't think we do. We do give authors the option to opt out of all of the questions, but what they're tending to do in all of the questions that we give them is just tick the first box, which is making the data completely null and void. I just wondered if those of you that are also collecting data are having the same challenges, or whether this is in part, and I think we are going to be reviewing the way we ask the questions and the questions we ask, but I just wondered if you've got any similar experience.
Thank you, Mandy. That's really interesting insight. At Taylor & Francis, we're not currently using collecting demographic questions, answers from authors. Apart from, we used it in the editor survey and then the setup of our editorial advisory board. The engagement from editors in those exercises was really good. The majority were happy to self-describe on all three questions. I think we had 850 participants and about 624 chose to answer the question, and not very many were answering the question with prefer not to disclose. And I didn't see that same pattern happening of picking the top answer. I think that behaviour of authors during the submission process might well be different. I think that we all have that experience of kind of working with a system online and you're just ticking tick boxes to try and get your thing ordered or your thing done, and we know anecdotally that authors do sometimes exhibit the same kinds of behaviour. So within TNF, for instance, I'm thinking about, well, can I collect the data from authors at a different point in their journey when they're not focused so much on getting their submission done? So that might be, one thing that publishers can consider, which is sort of skipping the submission system vendors and actually thinking about other ways that they can ask their authors about the questions. It would be wonderful to have somebody come and participate in the books group if you're collecting it from books authors specifically.
I have written that down and I'll have a chat with the books team.
Great.
Yeah, I would say we collect ours at contract stage. I don't know if that has any difference. I'd also be interested to know if it's they have to give an answer on your survey. No, so they could just ignore it. So, yeah, that would be the only other reason I would think that people would just to tick something to get it going. But yeah, we do ours at contract stage. It's a separate form. It's not mandatory to submit it. We remind people once, and otherwise we don't get it. But I haven't so much seen the top option. But it'll be interesting to see, particularly from our US-based authors over the next few months, if there's still the same level of engagement. We've had good engagement to this point, but we'll be monitoring it, and we collect and kind of collate it every month.
Thank you.
I have to say our survey went out in September and we had good engagement from the US. It might be very different when we redo it this year.
Deborah Dixon from OUP. I'm probably jumping in before Laura's about to respond on the OUP experience, just to share. I mean, we're only using it, using the questions on journals and the submission system. And again, we're not seeing that phenomenon that Mandy described. We're seeing, pretty realistic data coming through, and we do share that data regularly with journals. I guess, we're all looking at the questions and perhaps thinking of revisions, but I do think we have a challenge there, because what we want to do now we've been collecting the data for a while, is to really do that benchmarking and setting objectives. And my concern is that if we start changing the questions too much, then the data is quite difficult to compare. So I wonder if you had any thoughts on that, Fiona, in terms of the next stage. And also, I think we'd like to work with the coalition on where we go next. But if we're going to be using different data, that's going to become more challenging, I think.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge. I'm not aware of an OUP person who is coming to the working group meetings regularly, but like I say, I've only been the chair for a year, so we've only had 3 meetings in that time. So absolutely come and get involved in some of the subgroups and input into that decision making that we're making around changes. I think that we're still at the stage of adoption, frankly. So the goal at the moment is to be able to work on the questions to the point in which the majority of our members are able to use them, or able to very slightly tweak them to meet their own needs. And Joe and I have made that decision that we are not holding to them as a prescriptive set of standardised questions. If an organisation, we're more interested in adoption than we are in everybody doing it with exactly the same wording that we've set out. So we need to have that flexibility, I think. I would also really like to get to benchmarking as well and target setting, and have started some really interesting conversations within Taylor and Francis about sort of what methods we might take to do that, and what do benchmarks look like. And there's by no means any decisions, but lots of interesting things like, should we be reflecting the field that a journal is publishing? Should we be looking at 50-50? I really like something that Elsevier used in their gender report recently, which is zone of parity. So that idea of being between 40 and 60%. I'm talking here about sort of gender split. And so that kind, lots of different conversations about how we might do benchmarking, which I think we need to start quite early, because they're going to be quite interesting, challenging conversations to come to a position where, particularly in the current environment, we're willing to go public with what our goals are.
Yeah, and I'm part of the data subgroup, and I know there's been discussions about having a specific benchmarking subgroup. So I think we will be starting those conversations shortly. And as you say, there's a lot of challenges and different topics to think about. Okay, so I think we've actually reached time for the close of the session, but I'm sure if anyone has any other questions or points of interest, everyone will be happy to continue these discussions later during the coffee break. So I know that we are now having coffee for, I think, 30 minutes, and we will reconvene here at 12:15 for the session on Sustainable Development Goals. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks.
Oh, and one more thanks to our panellists.